Hi, everybody. My name is Craig Hardesty, and I am the board chair of Out on Film. And I am delighted to be here today as we begin our festival run coming up as we celebrate our collective queer joy. It is with absolute queer joy that I announce the winners of this year's screenplay competition for both our narrative feature and our narrative short. And we have Craig Bettendorf, who has won the screenplay competition for narrative feature for his screenplay Jeb. And Adesola Thomas, who is our narrative short screenplay winner for their screenplay Marigold Leaves Her Body. And so I want to welcome both of you to Out on Film, and I want to congratulate both of you as the winners of our screenplay competition.
Whoa, yay.
Yay, very good. Yay to both of you. And I do want to start out by saying, one of the things that we are always looking for, and the reason that we started a screenplay competition was really to identify early in the process, queer voices, queer stories that we feel tell us something different and new, or something that we need to know or want to know, and be able to identify and celebrate, those stories and voices that we feel speak to us, as our mission at Out on Film is to elevate queer artists and queer voices. And as we talked about the screenplays, which was very strong this year, as we pick the winners, and we just do this organically, and we look at it, and one of the things that stood out that I'm very proud of is that both of you represent in your stories a very wide spectrum of our history and kind of where we are now. So I want to start, Craig, by having you talk about Jeb, and tell us a little bit about the story. And it's really coming from, a time in the 80s, and a little bit before that, from John Boswell, who I always kind of think laid the foundation for kind of where we are today. So Craig, talk to us a little bit about the importance, that John Boswell brings to the movement, and kind of what brought you to tell his story.
I'd be happy to. I actually began writing for film in episodic, and after a little bit of success, did a pilot for a docuseries titled "Sorry We Missed You, ... John Boswell." And the idea was to introduce people that have done great things in the world, but who have kind of fallen off our collective consciousness radar. And John Boswell certainly impacted my life dramatically, growing up in the 70s, matriculating in the 80s. Most of us came from, a church family background, and then all of a sudden we were told, you are no longer part of this. And he was the one lone voice in the wilderness saying, not so fast, moral majority, not so fast, Newt Gingrich. We have a long and storied history, not only in Christianity or in families of faith, but we also have a long storied history in history itself. We just need to reclaim it and find it and identify it. So from that one pilot episode, we received just tremendous feedback that people wanted to know more. And the beauty of the pilot episode is it actually became the bridge in which I met John Boswell's brother and sister, who are still alive today. And they introduced me to his friends and colleagues. And they implored me at the time to consider a longer format thing, perhaps a documentary. And although I wanted to write the screenplay that I've now written, similar to Milk or similar to Rustin, I really didn't have the personal involvement or the first person connections to write it. It would have all been, from my imagination versus from reality. And because of the pilot, I was introduced to these people. They took me in as a friend and, shared their intimate knowledge and understanding of his life and how important both his friendship and his work was, his mentorship. and as a family member, a brother, and that allowed me to write the screenplay Jeb, which you have now so valuably lauded. Thank you so much. And the importance for me is that it's a timeless story of how one person's contribution can truly change things for the better for masses of people. Because the books that he wrote in the 80s and 90s and the things that he argued really helped us secure a place within greater society that led to things like marriage equality. If John Boswell hadn't finished his book, Same-Sex Unions in Medieval Europe, prior to his death, the marriage equality debate might not have ended up the way it did, with many mainline churches supporting the whole concept. So thank you so much for acknowledging the screenplay. My greatest hope is to continue to enter it in screenplay and festivals, sharpen it to its absolute best, and then push it through to production companies and perhaps a studio or two, and maybe even the Academy's Nico Fellowship next year.
Excellent, excellent. So as Boswell and your script kind of let us know, one of the things that John discovered is we have always been here. we have always been here. And as we looked at this, you know, Adesola, when we read Marigold Leaves Her Body, I kind of felt like there's such a sense of pride, at least for me, as kind of like the old troll here, you know, thinking like how far we've come to have this beautiful collection of people that you are writing about, you know, that are transcending, you know, gender lines and orientations, and just this kind of beautiful queer moment that you create for us. So talk to us a little bit about how Marigold came to you.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really glad to be in conversation with y'all and to be able to talk about this movie. Marigold emerged in a place within me that kind of stems from my love for like do-it-yourself subculture in Atlanta. I grew up in Henry County, which some people consider like the ethno-urban boondocks just outside of Atlanta, like OTP. And when I was growing up, I was ricocheting between this very like charismatic Christian evangelical Nigerian immigrant space and like public school. And it was through public school that I started meeting kids who were in bands and who were in punk bands, hardcore bands, do-it-yourself kind of things, where there'd be local venues that they'd go and play at on the weekends. And these spaces were such a revelation to me when I was 15, 16, 17, not only because I was meeting other kids my age who were like making things and interested in making things together, but also because there was sort of a freedom there when it came to queer expression. I feel very grateful as a filmmaker to be alive in a time where people my age have language for identity and are open to talking about these sorts of things with each other. But I think being in those spaces initially when I was 15, I was meeting queer folks who were in all kinds of relationships, whether it be platonic or romantic or otherwise, people who are queering the way that they approach their art and their relational life. So Marigold is kind of like my homage film to that space and to those cultural spaces, how they've offered people opportunity to experience affinity together, whether that be listening to music, dancing to music, or like making music, but also perhaps the like freedom in gathering to make. Yeah, I wonder if what I'm saying is feeling legible. I think it's like people don't know that Black queer punks exist often. There's not a lot of like film evidence of our existence or our ways of relating our rhythms with each other. And it's specifically not so much in the South. So I knew that I wanted to kind of fill that gap and go like, you know, here's a space that does exist and means a lot to the people who participate in it and who also find kind of catharsis and like opportunity for ritual social gathering and communion in these spaces. Yeah, so Marigold Leaves Her Body is really like my celebration of those subcultures, but like what one great house show, what one great party, how you might be having a string of difficult weeks or difficult months, but when you return to this space where you're known and loved and feel legible, how it can help you kind of return to yourself. Yeah, and how the music and the dance that takes place in in these spaces also help people return to themselves. I wanted to make a film or write about a film that really honored that space that, you know, shaped me so much in my upbringing.
There's so much in our culture, uh, over time, the ways that we create. A lot of times we talk a lot about our chosen families, but the ways in which our communities always come together. And both of you include these core groups of people that either Marigold is coming back to or trying to find again, or that John is kind of using as his support system to write this, and and write his books literally as a race against time in his case. So both of you talk just a little bit about kind of as your writing process, how you create like these groupings of people, these families of people who come together just to support each other, to do the work, to take care of each other, and this the importance of that in the community. And Craig, I'll let you start with that.
Well, I think Armiston Maupin said it the best when he said we often go from segueing away from our biological family to our logical family. And I think both of our stories share that. Being queer people, we tend to make relationships within the sphere of queerness. And certainly in the case of Boswell, it was said that he had Friday night open houses in he and his partner's home for the 20 some years that he was at Yale. And they were open to any queer person, teacher, friend, student that wanted to just drop in on a Friday night and have some food and just sit around and talk about, queer life in 1975, 1980, 1985, all the way up to say 94. So, just identifying those people with whom you can make community. And then the hugest benefit, work together to make the world a better place for not only yourself, but for future generations. I mean, that speaks volumes to me, and I hope it will to the viewing public one day as well.
And Adesola, there are the scenes in Marigold where Marigold is kind of re-entering, as you said, the scene, not knowing if she could, or and the way that she is embraced by that community that you discover and write about.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Marigold, before the film starts, she's experienced partner abuse in the like do-it-yourself kind of punk music scene that she's a part of. So we meet her at a time where she's been away from this space maybe for a year, partially for fear of encountering this person who, caused her harm, but partially from a place of also trying to reacclimate and understand, like, what does it mean to found this place of affinity, for it to have been a place that I was harmed, but to also be a place where I'm still loved. How can I kind of recalibrate how to relate to people who know me and have known me before and after this harm? So there's a way in which the house show that she goes to in the world of the script, most of it takes place in a single evening at a single party. But there's ways in which, as she's returning to the scene, she's also trying to figure out how to return to herself. And I wanted to write from that place of complexity because I think there can be spaces of queer affinity, but something we sometimes do is like flatten them by not also talking about the conflict that takes place there and what it looks like to rebuild after that conflict. Like, I think queer lives are inherently deeply relational lives, but that means that in addition to the joy, in addition to the celebration, in addition to the camaraderie, there's also space for hiccup and missing each other and hurting each other. So I think the best way I knew how to celebrate the humanity of Marigold and the characters around her who love her, both at home and in the scene, was by telling a story not just from a point of pure affinity, but of reconnection. What does it mean to return to a place where you have been loved, but maybe have departed and like come back to? Is there still love there waiting for you? So I think the way that I knew to honor the humanity that I've experienced and exchanged and indulged in alongside the people that I know in my creative community was to explore this kind of spectrum of emotion. But within that, implicitly, like the beauty of returning to a place where maybe hurt or harm transpired, but where there is still love and people who are willing to like tend to complex feelings, complex experiences alongside you to together go like, okay, and what happens now? And what do we want next?
I think too, there is a strength that comes through, whether it is through that reconnection or Craig, like in Boswell's case, it was not this was not an easy thing for him to do in the 70s, to be an out unapologetically gay man, even in academia where it's supposed to be a lot better. It then it there's no there it wasn't.
No.
I mean, it wasn't. I mean, so I'd like for both of you to talk about how you view that source of strength that being queer, being gay, kind of the strength that it one takes to kind of put yourself out in the world in this way and just to really be unapologetic about it. And like you said, open your home, be open, be the visible person at times when it may not be the easiest, thing in the world to do.
Craig?
Go ahead, Greg.
I was waiting for my cue, sorry.
Yeah.
Either of us can start, it's up to you.
So as far as the story of Jeb and in the life of Boswell, I found it fascinating that he graduated from college with his bachelor's degree from William and Mary, which is in Northern Virginia, the same year that the Stonewall riots occurred.
Mm.
And that clearly impacted him dramatically. And he went to Harvard the next year and started his doctorate degree there, his PhD. And it was there in his PhD student years that he started his research and realizing that LGBTQ history was woven into the strands of all history, but that it was blacked out. Like when you see a memo from the CIA and they've blacked out almost every word,
Yeah.
Our histories were blacked out. And he realized while he was at Harvard that he would need to be able to read and write and understand dozens of languages and find the original source materials that the people that had been blacking stuff out about queer people for millennia hadn't gotten to yet. And that's exactly what he did. He ended up learning anywhere between 14 and 17 ancient and dead languages. And in doing so became a linguistic marvel to which other scholars would come to and say, could you check my understanding of this ancient, this ancient document? Am I accurate? So he was the guy that people would come to for validation of their own research. So when he is gay in 1969 and out in 1970 and learning all these languages and getting access to all of these places that you have to be highly credentialed for, his first book came out of nowhere. No one saw it coming because no one even thought it was possible. No one even knew that we had a history that was buried and blacked out until he started pulling together not 2 or 3 items, but dozens and dozens that led to hundreds and hundreds of documents that showed that we have always been part of the human community and that we have been virtuous and we have been celebrated and we have, had high points in society and the lowest of low points in society. But the one thing is that we've always been part of it.
Mm.
And I think, Adesola, you add on to that, you talk about too the Black queer punk scene. So showing that Black queer culture is not a monolith either.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's People contain multitudes. This is a common phrasing, of course, but I think there's also a multiplicity of ways in which queerness expresses itself, even within like racial kind of communities. And I wanted to be able to speak to that. And it was important to me to not only talk about like queer romance, but also queer friendships, to the thing that you're saying about to the initial question, in your prompt. I think there's a level of self-permission that is required that like queerness demands, to whether that looks like somebody choosing to be out, but also to kind of interrogate scripts that are prescribed to them, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man, if those are things that people actually actively identify with, or if those are labels that aren't accurate to them. What love can look like, whether that's being expressed in a sexual and erotic way, or a platonic way, a communal or familial way. So I think like investigating one's own queerness and developing a relationship to it is deeply personal, but also is deeply interpersonal. And I think that self-permission that can arise as the interrogation or the self-understanding like blossoms over time translates into our relational lives. So I was really excited to be able to explore that among like all of these Black queer punks, the different ways that people show up to each other. Marigold becomes something of a recluse after she goes through this very public breakup, unraveling with this person in the scene. She mostly just holds herself up in her grandfather's house, reading books and trying to finish her own music. But there are ways that her friends, try to, come out, come be with us. We want to see that sort of thing. There are other people who are delighted to see her when she is at the party, but folks who we imagine maybe didn't text or call. So I'm really interested in the ways that people express care in queer spaces, but also the multiplicity of ways that shows up or is expressed. Some people are hands-on and will bring you a lasagna. Other people will call and pester you. Other people will just be delighted when they do finally see you. And then it'll occur to them like, oh, I should have checked in, but you were on my mind. That. So I wanted to honor all of these ways as being like true and authentic and like legitimate and worthy of exploration. And that's something I'm really excited about ultimately with the film is, I have lots of friends who are DJs and like local rave spaces and, friends in bands and tattoo artists and that sort of thing. My dream for the film, when we ultimately make it in Atlanta, is to have all of these folks populate the party scenes, to actually be the people performing, to actually be the people dancing, so that in 10, 15, 20 years, when we look back on the movie, we'll be able to go like, oh, there we were, which is, I think one of the most beautiful things about capturing these kinds of stories is just being able to make evidence that we were here because we were. And some of the time we loved each other very well, and other times we were just learning how to love each other at all, And I think that kind of nexus and that liminal space of being is really worth capturing on film.
Excellent. I think in the time that we have remaining, we've talked about what it's like to, to come out in the 70s, in the 80s. I don't want to be remiss, that Boswell was working in a time when we were also, in the throes of AIDS, as an epidemic, and and just to acknowledge that his was, as for so many, of an age, of that age, whose life was cut and work was cut way too short. The tragedy of, again, like his was literally a race against time. And Craig, tell us, the importance of that, of his operating in that era with everything that was happening.
Sure. So having lived in the same era myself, I can speak to it a bit more first person as well, but also having had relationships now with his closest friends and colleagues, I can tell you emphatically that he was very aware as many of his friends began to get sick and die rapidly. He became kind of an in-between for some of his friends who had not even come out to their parents, and they were full-grown adults at the time. And he would often broker deals to bring the parents to the hospital to visit their dying. Sorry, I'm getting choked up.
Yeah.
And the fact that the the pandemic didn't spare him either.
Yeah. I mean, because they came up in the same time. You know, and people like him were instrumental for us to at a time when no one else really cared, you know, to
No
show,
one
and they
else.
did, and they did. You know, so I did want to acknowledge the time and place, and the import of the context in which John was living. And like for so many of us reading this script from this time, you know, it was our experience.
Yeah.
This was, and I remember reading him in real time.
Yeah, absolutely.
It, you know, doing this in real time was just it is just, you know, something to be reminded of and to have him remembered in this way. You know, I do, and to kind of bring us forward to today, you know, are things better or not? I mean, at this point in time, I don't know that any of us are 100% sure. It seems like we are always, you know, under someone's gun, you know, for attack or you know, whatever, you know, is happening at the moment. And so I ask each of you to kind of reflect a little bit right now about what it means to you to be a gay writer, a queer artist at this time. And, you know, and not to toot our horn here out on film, but why, you know, organizations that promote queer voices and queer film and queer art are still relevant and important. I guess I'll let you take the lead there.
Yeah, I feel very grateful to be who I am and to have the community that I do. I feel like there are always more strains or reaches we can make towards our collective liberation. Like I like to think about freedom not as like a place we'll ultimately arrive, but like a small town we're always preparing to move to, sort of thing. And I feel really grateful to have people that I'm like packing with, moving with, preparing with, that sort of thing. And I think this festival, organizations like this are important so that we're not obscured in like collective memory, so that we're not forgotten. And so just like I was saying before, we can't create evidence that we were here on our own terms, in our own language, you know, rather than people deciding what it might have felt like for us or imagining. Like Saidiya Hartman sometimes talks about critical fabulation. When there are gaps in history, you know, if people weren't able to leave memoirs or diaries behind, people will look at historical events and the context and try to surmise what might have happened. But because of organizations like this and ones that are doing like adjacent work, similar work, people are able to have the resources, the spaces, the, I don't know, community needed to be able to kind of tell stories on their own terms and to decide what they want to have for their posterity to look back on. And I think that'll always be important. And the beautiful thing too about writing a script, telling a story, making a film, is that once it exists, it will never not exist again. And I think in that way, I don't know, we get to participate in a sort of birth that's really beautiful and also powerful beyond even maybe our capacity to fully understand in real time.
And Craig, I'll give you the last word on that.
So one thing that John Boswell's work taught us as just students of history is that acceptance of LGBTQ people has always been cyclical. We go from being, you know, fully accepted and integrated in society with lavish weddings and ceremonies all the way back to the 3rd century for sure, to being completely blacked out of history and having to live on the margins of society in secret and in darkness. And I think that organizations like Out on Film and organizations that support queer voices to rise above the fray are just so important to preserving both our history and charting the course of what our trajectory to the future should be and will be. So thank you.
All right. Well, I want to thank you both. I congratulate you both, you know, for entering and winning our screenplay competitions, and really from all of us here at Out on Film, to really thank you both for sharing your stories and your voices with us and with our audiences, and in the hopes that, you know, we do get to see these, you know, at the festival on screen. I mean, that's really the goal for us. And so anything that we can do to help propel the telling of these stories in final form is what we are all about. And for all of us here is really how we express and embrace our own queer joy, is by finding stories and voices like the ones that both of you are telling, that really speak to us on a really human and actually just queer level that just really resonates. And so I want to thank you and congratulate you. And I want to tell everybody out there who is listening and watching and participating, these are the voices of now and the voices of tomorrow. And we all need to do whatever we can do to promote queer art and queer voices, and make sure that we are here, that we will always be here. And we're just going to embrace our own queer joy. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you both for being here with us at Out on Film.
Thank you.